Good afternoon. My name is Aisha Bell Hardaway. I'm the co-director of the Social Justice Law Center. Thank you for joining us for the Dr. Maya Angelou and Professor Calvin Sharp Distinguished Interdisciplinary Lecture on Peaceful Conflict. The Distinguished Lecture on Peaceful Conflict seeks to highlight the work of scholars, researchers, and practitioners who have insights that contribute to literature on the settlement of disputes. Today is April 4th, 2022. It marks what would have been Dr. Maya Angelou's 94th birthday. Before Dr. Angelou became a renowned author, poet, and recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, she was a civil rights activist who assumed the role as Northern Coordinator for the New York office of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1960. It was through this work that she met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Today also marks the day that Dr. King was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968, 54 years ago. It has been reported that Dr. Angelou did not celebrate her birthday for many years because of the painful connection to Dr. King's assassination. I forgot, is she on? Professor Calvin Sharp, the Galen J. Rausch Professor Emeritus of Law, conceived of this lecture. Professor Sharp retired after 30 years of teaching at Case Law School, where he was a faculty member and a valued colleague to many. His daughter, Dr. Adrienne Jones, is joining us virtually to share a few remarks about Professor Sharp.
I guess that means I should turn on my video. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am here just to welcome you to the lecture. I am sure that my father, Calvin Sharp, would love to be here today. Part of why I'm not there is because I just left Arizona, trying to take care of some business.
We can't see her.
We can see her, but we're not hearing her.
We can't hear her.
Exactly.
Okay.
So maybe we can return to her in short.
Yeah, maybe she can round us out at the end. I'm fine with that. I hope she is too. Today's distinguished lecturer, Dr. Robeson Taj Frazier, is joining us today to deliver the Dr. Maya Angelou and Professor Calvin Sharp Distinguished Interdisciplinary Lecture on Peaceful Conflict. Dr. Frazier is an associate professor of communication and director of the IDEA Institute for Diversity Empowerment at Annenberg. He is the author of 2 books, a multimedia film producer, and has published articles and essays about US Black social movements, political ideologies, globalization, fine arts, popular culture, and US-China relations and cultural contact. His most recent work, Chaos Theory, is that right? Chaos Theory? The Afro-Cosmic Arc of Ben Caldwell is a forthcoming book and media arts platform that explores the creative contributions and philosophical insights of Los Angeles filmmaker and media arts artist Ben Caldwell and the community arts organization he founded. The book, Frazier's first book, The East is Black, Cold War China in Black Radical Imagination, analyzes the political and cultural ties cultivated between China and US Black political movements during the Cold War and the role that travel, media, and representation played in this process. His second project, It's Yours, a story about hip hop and the internet, is a documentary film that examines how hip hop's artists and the broader global hip hop community's use of the internet and digital technologies has revolutionized the music industry and global youth culture. Frazier received his BA in Africana Studies and International Relations at the University of Pennsylvania and his PhD in Africana Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Before joining USC, he taught at New York University, Princeton University, and CUNY Bronx Community College. He served as a history, arts, and cultural instructor in Oakland and New York City public schools, and created music and performed as an MC rapper, independently releasing 2 albums and a mixtape. And for that, you get major props. After Dr. Frazier presents, we have a treat, an extra little bonus package for us today. We have Professor Brian Adamson, who is the David L. and Ann Brennan Professor of Law and our Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion. His areas of expertise are mass media and First Amendment law, and he has practiced extensively in reentry advocacy, housing, mortgage lending, and consumer protection. Professor Adamson rejoins us at Case from Seattle University School of Law, where he taught for 18 years. And he has co-authored scores of articles and publications and joins us today to share his research on media and the construction of Black deviance and Black oppression. In 2016, Professor Adamson received the William Pincus Award for Excellence in Clinical Legal Education by the Association of American Law Schools, and that same year was awarded the Provost Award for Excellence in Research and Scholarship. So now we're going to have Dr. Frazier, and then after that we'll have Dean Adamson. Thank you so much. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Frazier.
Thank you. Such a gracious welcome, and I should have given you the condensed bio. But in any case, hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. For those of you who are with us virtually, send greetings, and I hope you're well. First off, I just want to express my gratitude to Professor Aisha Bell Hardaway, as well as to Eric Seiler for all the work they've done in coordinating my visit. This is an extreme honor, and I'm very excited to be here. Thank you all again for having me to provide this year's Dr. Maya Angelou and Professor Calvin Sharp interdisciplinary lecture on peaceful conflict. I'm traveling here from Los Angeles, and I brought everybody a special gift. 70-degree weather, sunshine. All right. Unfortunately, the airport lost my bag. So it should arrive later this week, but I was told that if you send me back to LA with Darius Garland, I was told, the weather will remain for 6 to 8 months. No, I'm teasing, but as you can tell by my humor, I'm happy to be here. This is my first actually academic related travel in 2 years, my first presentation in person in fellowship with other human beings, not through a screen. So I'm particularly excited to share space with all of you. Now, I'll just say this, I'm not an attorney or a scholar of legal theory and law, but nonetheless, I remain very fascinated by the law, and moreover by the work that people like many of you do, and the work that you all do in terms of how you approach and treat the law, not as some fixed, set in stone entity or bounded domain of human activity and action, but rather as a series of historical institutions, discourses, and processes through which power flows and through which challenges to power and oppression can be mobilized. I admire those of you who treat the law, most especially American law, as something that is still in need of critical questioning, reflection, and reckoning, and who remain steadfast in your commitment to being in service to ethical and transformative visions of justice, equity, and human potential. With my time, I'm going to share a little bit about how I think about history, how it intersects with some of the general themes of peace and conflict resolution. If I have time, the latter part of my talk will go into some detail about an organization that I collaborate with in Los Angeles and the ways they've deployed media arts to stimulate healing, imagination, and foster community among young people struggling against policing, gentrification, and economic inequality. So as I said, being here with you is a prestigious honor for me. First off, it's a great privilege to speak on this day, which serves as a memorial to the April 4th, 1968 assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. It's a day that honors his life and work, as well as that of a multitude of others, and which situates these people's faith, determination, and resistance as a lens to think about the long arc of struggles for justice and peace and the work that still lies ahead of us. Furthermore, I'm truly honored to participate in a lecture that also highlights the contributions of Dr. Maya Angelou. What always stood out to me most about Dr. Maya Angelou is the uncategorization, like, well, how you cannot categorize, right? You cannot categorize the nature of the life that she lived, how her creative practice, her support for others, her life experience blurred the lines between how we might conventionally imagine the work and life of a poet, an author, an intellectual, a mother, a cultural critic, and an activist. Dr. Angelou lived many lives. Yet what is important is that she shared facets of this experience and its complexity and complications with us, with the world. In her biographies or writings, she centers her experience as a site and conceptual space to explore the legacy and daily lived conditions of love, community, racism, patriarchy, sexism, class politics, and movements for change and justice. Her work continues to offer many of us generative rest stops to think deeply about the arc of our individual and collective lives, of our struggles, and the meanings and lifelong lessons that can be ascertained from intergenerational exchanges with our elders and with their legacies. Even more, I'm grateful to speak today because this event is not just a tribute to Dr. Angelou and Dr. King, but also to Professor Calvin William Sharp. Professor Sharp is an important scholar, professor of law, and an intellectual leader who contributed to this university, Case Western Reserve School of Law, for over 30 years, right? But he also influenced faculty, students, alum, public advocates, leaders, and artists over his lifetime. And he too has built a life that sidesteps easy categorization. He's an expert in labor and employment issues, founder of this law school's Center for Interdisciplinary Study of Conflict and Dispute Resolution, a board member of the Just Peace Center for Mediation and Conflict Transformation, a supporter of the arts and humanities, a scholar with a prolific publishing profile, and most importantly, a gracious and loving father, husband, and friend to many. I too have been fortunate to benefit from his insight, tutelage, and love because he's one of my father's dearest friends. Moreover, it was Professor Sharp who invited me on 2 occasions years ago to spend significant time with he and another of his dearest friends, Dr. Maya Angelou. Both experiences were very memorable occasions, but for this event, I'll just talk about one. It was about 20 years ago. I, along with my parents and my grandmother, Perline, we visited Dr. Angelou's home in Winston-Salem. It was a fall day, or at least my memory recalls it as such. The leaves outside were a variety of vibrant colors, demonstrating autumn's midpoint process of transition to winter. Dr. Angelou graciously welcomed us into her home. She had a wide smile, a twinkle in her eye, and for several hours we sat with her in her den and we discussed numerous things. I can't recall much of the nature of the exchange. I was the youngest person in the party, so I was a bit more on the periphery of the discussion than a central part of its circuit. But what stood out to me most was the connection shared between Dr. Angelou and my grandmother, Perline. Over the course of our time there, they talked about their gardens, what they grew, what they ate, right? Who they learned from, and what time of year was the best for certain crops, where they grew up and the different herbs and vegetables their families relied on and raised. Between the two of them was a force, an electricity, a magnetism. It was an ancestral mode of knowing and understanding. And even as a young man, I felt it. It was only a decade later that I realized that within their discussion of greens, beans, herbs, soil, and climate was so much more. It was a dialogue about care, about the labor and time and energy and commitment required of tending to and nurturing and preserving life, both human and non-human. It was a discussion about genealogy, about who taught you and who passed on what, and about kinship and about its ability to withstand death, that even the dead continue to communicate to us, often in tongues outside the dominant order and its modes of listening and recording. And it was a discussion about struggle, about the times and conditions and catastrophes that they endured and to which their families and ancestors endured, of the trauma and scars that they carried in their bones, spirits, and minds. And oddly enough, in these two elder women's hidden yet shared understanding was an acknowledgement that there was an art to it all, a quiet calm and peace, what some might call a beauty, that is, although what is meant by beauty signifies something different than conventional notions of beauty and virtue, right? No, this kind of beauty that they shared was a bended, majestic, magnetic curve of sorts, one that moreover linked them as if they were cosmic sister cousins. We might call it an arc. Their dialogue and connection was an example of cultural intercontinental retention, of the legacy of their ancestors and of the magic they carried in their heads and their bodies, which they then conjured on new shores, distant lands, and amid new and different people. The filmmaker Arthur Jaffa explains this idea well when he says, quote, "People carry culture on various levels, down to the deepest level, which I would call a kind of core stability." Jaffa says, Naim June Pike, the godfather of video art, has this great quote: "The culture that's going to survive in the future is the culture that you can carry around in your head," end quote. What Jaffa describes is the magic of Black minds and Black histories. That is how culture and tradition and transformation have been transmitted, transferred, and stored through different kinds of practices of language, music, dance, movement, visuality, and the everyday life. With this and other means, Black people and other people throughout the world have trekked out ulterior courses and trajectories of life and expression. Ulterior meaning that which exists beyond, that which is intentionally hidden. This is what I like to refer to as a different arc of life and existence. That is to say, modes of being, knowing, doing, circulation that offer alternatives, understandings, and practices of peace, solidarity, in the future. It is the search and reclamation of these traditions of cultural retention, transfer, circulation, and magic that's at the heart of my research. Much of my time is spent in archives with historical documents and other ephemera, reading other people's work, interviewing people. Within this and other mediums of information, I try to move beyond just pinpointing events, institutions, and larger societal forces, the usual protagonists and anchors of historical narrative. Instead, I try to mine these different kinds of materials to make sense and illuminate the magic that I just described. That is, those bonds of connection and transference and interiority, that is the inner character, nature, and momentum that they reveal. This is especially important when considering the experiences of people of color and people of African descent in the Americas and elsewhere. The historical and current day conditions of violence that Black people endure, as well as the afterlives of this, operates via practices and institutions that extend beyond the military, the police, the court system, social service institutions, healthcare, the environment, etc. It also operates via the academy, via the legal system, institutions like yours and mine, most especially in the limited ways that Black people and Black lives and experiences have been imagined, constructed, and documented. The brilliant writer, scholar, and critical theorist Saidiya Hartman is one of numerous people to interrogate this issue, that is the systemic and historical violence of the archive. Hartman describes the archive rather as a death sentence and a tomb and a display of a violated body. She definitely makes her case in a well-regarded and cited essay called Venus in Two Acts, where she interrogates the failure of the archive to document Black life and its erasure of Black girls and women from the public memory of racial violence. The case study she uses to make this argument is a late 18th century court case, the trial of Captain John Kimber for the murder of two female Negroes on board the Recovery, African slave ship, 1792. On trial for killing two enslaved women aboard a slave ship, the defendant was ultimately acquitted, and one of the enslaved, a dead girl named Venus, is only referred to once by name via all of the court documents. The court proceedings' inability to imagine these enslaved women as something more than just property, right? As having lives and relationships beyond that of a commodity to an aggrieved owner, is a reminder to Hartman of the unhuman, not human status of the enslaved and the failure and omission of the loss of these women's stories in the archive. Where can we or must we go, Hartman asked, to explore what could have been between these two women? How can we presumably, with these materials of the archive, paint a full picture of their lives, as well as that of other captives? What voices and experiences are untranslatable in the archive? Hartman's questions are instructive because they oscillate around bigger questions, bigger dilemmas, such as, what are the stories that we tell ourselves in dark times? How can we enable a place for the living and envision an alternative future when the conventional tools of discovery and imagination are so limited, so narrow in their conception of our being, in their understanding of who we are and what we're capable of? In the end, Hartman rejects the idea of cultivating a romantic narrative that recovers these women's lives. Instead, she posits that it's essential for us to perceive how their lives and the age in which they lived are tethered to our own. right? So she wants us to understand the relationship between these women's lives and that of Sandra Bland. She wants us to perceive how the physical, symbolic, and epistemic violence exhibited against them as part of a long arc of violence against Black women, and moreover, Black people, a violence that took place in the slave ship and the court system, as well as in the historical archive. Moreover, Hartman and others assert that in our efforts to theorize about the relations forged between these captives, these casualties of war, we must look elsewhere to imagine and activate an awareness of this, and to sense the legacy and the afterlives of these relations. Dr. Angelou and my grandmother, Perline, may be privy to some of this on that fall afternoon. Gardening in the garden, they showcased to me, was both a media, and when I say media, I mean like kind of definition of media, a means of communication, right? But the garden was also a medium, right? And definition of a medium, right? Which is the substance through which impressions are conveyed to the senses, or which an organism lives and is cultured, right? Medium. The particular form of storage of digitized information. So for those of us who live in a kind of digital age, right? Thinking about the garden as a space where information is digitized, saved in the mind, and then shared and circulated through people, communicated, right? Medium, the material form used by an artist or composer, right? So thinking about it from a kind of creative perspective, artistic perspective, right? Medium, right? To communicate between the dead and the living, right? So the garden as a medium, a modes of communication between us and ancestral worlds. The garden thus offers a useful metaphor and analogy for the creative strategies of care, nurture, and experimentalism taken up by Black people and others in the world. They're a reminder of the different tools these people have relied upon amid global warfare, militarism, state-sanctioned violence, poverty, increasing houselessness, mass incarceration, climate and environmental damage and neglect, and the intergenerational psychosocial trauma, anxiety, and crises of mental health. It's a reminder of what they've had to mobilize amid experiences where peace seems impossible, right? It's also a reminder of the power of the imagination and the role of imaginaries of freedom, justice, and equity, the role that they play in rejecting the status quo and demanding something different. You see, it's important to note that for Black movements and moreover Black people, imagining justice, equity, freedom, and peace has been essential. Hence, in many ways, imagining, right, is a sensibility committed to believing that something else is possible, right? And imagining thus must be the prerequisite for movements for social change. One must cultivate this kind of sensibility within the mind and activate it within communal formation. It is in this vein, Black people's conceptions of peace and justice don't exist in some far off post-liberation moment, but are theorized, experimented with, and practiced in spaces of daily life. In gardens, in schools, families, social and creative endeavors, church groups, organizations, and classrooms. Within these spaces, old and new value systems are transmitted and transformed. How can we prepare ourselves for a brighter tomorrow if we're not enacting it in the now, not testing it out and incubating it with others, right? Think about it from the standpoint of musicians, right? Musicians have to spend a lot of time doing what? Practicing, right? Practicing. How can we experience freedom, justice, equity, peace if we're not practicing it with those whom we're with on a daily basis? Dealing with the hard work, the challenges, right? Being reflexive, right? Reflecting about it. Lately, I've been exploring a lot of this in South Central Los Angeles. I've been working with an organization called Chaos Network, which is a multimedia lab and community space founded by filmmaker Ben Caldwell in 1984. Actually, show you an image of him. Ben is a filmmaker who came to some prestige in the 1970s as part of a collective called the LA Rebellion, group of filmmakers. They were making films out of UCLA, which really kind of challenged the bounds of cinema and which offered nuanced, complex depictions of Black diasporic life. In the 1980s, he founded this space known as Chaos Network. And the purpose was to provide filmmaking, technology, and arts education to middle class, working class, and low income youth from the neighborhood. And for 40 years, it's been a hub for creative community formation, most especially amid the crises of state violence, police brutality, poverty, and gentrification. At Chaos Network, art and media are treated as both instruments and tools for liberation, right? Tools for healing and cultivating personal and collective inner drives for peaceful and healthy conflict resolution. Ben's own commitment to this grew out of his experiences as an aspiring artist drafted into the Vietnam War. On the front lines of the war, he found refuge in art, right? He found refuge in his camera. Taking pictures of other soldiers of the Central Highlands of Vietnam, and as well as of the marginalized ethnic groups who lived in the surrounding area. Marginalized ethnic groups who were named by the French as the Montagnards, which means mountain people. This was a group that lived in the area surrounding the air base where he was stationed. Image making became his mode of developing solitude, and moreover, a means of refuting the prominently violent, chaotic depictions of Vietnam that were circulated by US journalists and the news media establishment. These images depicted moments, his images depicted moments of stillness and slight movement. They represented his own attempt to document the quiet, intimate life and relations that surrounded him, right? South Vietnam's expressive inner character. In so doing, he tried to present an image of Vietnam that was more than just the war, more than just an environment predicated by military campaigns and struggles. Through photography, he worked to disarticulate the symbolic bridge linking Vietnam and war within conventional American imaginations, right? So for many people, when they heard Vietnam, it ultimately signified in their mind war, chaos, menace. And for him, he said, yes, some of that was there. He said, but the majority of his experiences, especially with the Southern Vietnamese and the Montagnards, were anything but that, right? Through photography, he offered a window into relations between the Vietnamese and Americans that may have been structured by the conditions of war, but which didn't reproduce its dominant logics of antagonism and violence. Once he came back to the States, he expanded his practice through other mediums, including filmmaking, video, and later performance art. But it was at his studio turned community media arts lab, Chaos Network, that he built on these earlier creative interrogations of the dominant cultural logics of war. I'm just going to create a brief picture to you of the South LA that he created this space in, right? This is mid-1980s South Central Los Angeles, a period rife with intersecting crises that had their most severe impact on the city's poorest communities. Most significantly, its Black and brown residents, right? These are people hard hit by the tidal wave, right, of cuts in education and social services, deindustrialization, gang violence, drug addiction, and the Los Angeles Police Department's criminalization of Black and brown youth. Thus, one of his main goals when he opened the studio, right, and transformed it into an after-school space for youth was to develop their creative talents, right? And as well to create a safe space for them to convene, to actually experiment with one another in terms of cultivating spaces for peaceful conflict resolution and imaginaries of justice. Ben was of the belief that media and art, when in the hands of young people, would enable them to share stories, generate connection and solidarity with one another, and moreover, heal from the kind of trauma and daily injustice that they experienced and endured. And he was right. Together, they created media productions and strengthened their performance abilities through rap, singing, dancing, DJing, and later technology. Art, media, and the cultivation of their own creative space provided them with an important sanctuary that is an ark, right? If we're thinking about like kind of the notion of a biblical ark, right? A vessel or sanctuary that serves as protection against extinction, right? But let me expand actually on this notion of an ark. At Chaos Network, these young people were empowered to become and serve as arcs. And when I say arc now, I'm saying arc in terms of ARC, right? One of the ways that it's defined too is as a luminous electrical discharge between two electrodes or other points. If you've ever seen a projector, especially the old projectors from like the 1940s and 50s, they relied upon arc lamps, which were these contraptions that basically kind of created what could produce actually a fire, but nonetheless, the electricity of that spark produced what you would see on a screen, right? So in many ways, these young people have been empowered to be sparks of connection between one another, between different generations, between different kinds of philosophies and approaches to aesthetics, for the sake of creativity and for the sake of community. Chaos Network in many ways is like the gardens described by Dr. Maya Angelou, my grandmother. It is a space for planting seeds, nourishing life, and experimentation. These examples offer us much to think about in terms of how Black people have cultivated, nurtured, and preserved peace, ephemeral, ritual, habitual versions of peace, right? Over the course of several lifetimes. When I'm describing peace here, I'm not describing it as a noun, that is, as a set predetermined state or period of tranquility, freedom of disturbance, noise, or war. No, what I'm describing and signaling towards here is an alternative conception and lived experience of peace, or what we might describe as an ulterior, right? That which exists beyond, that which is intentionally hidden, conception of peace. This kind of conception and project of peace gestures towards lived experiences where disturbance, noise, and war are not short-lived or occasional, but are rather recurrent and ongoing. Where we must contend with the reality that we are operating in societies and predicaments predicated and structured by war, structured by disorder, structured by dissonance. Via this kind of thinking, peace is not a noun, but rather a verb. It's a holistic, ongoing, unending process and struggle, a potentiality that is attuned to other species and forms of life, and which through repetition of different duties of study, care, nurture, experimentation, improvisation, right? Practice, puts us in a position to fashion new lives, new pathways, new sensibilities. What Dr. Angelou and my grandmother Perline shared was a creative, poetic, imaginative mode of being and understanding and doing. This is the capacity to live and cultivate a creative practice of daily life, a daily practice of imagination and endurance that some of us might see as mundane, but which are vital and life-giving. When I say poetics here, or a poetic mode of being and thinking, I'm not simply referring to poetry, right? What I'm referring to is a poetic sensibility. That is, as exhibiting special powers of imagination and a sensitive frame of thinking and doing, which is intense with emotional depth and drive. Such a model of existence has been and continues to be essential. And it's essential especially to groups who are historically oppressed in this country, right? Groups who have fashioned lives and communities committed to and orbiting around peace, even when surrounded by war and conflict and antagonism. Such imaginings are also global. They've been organized around an understanding that Black people's safety and future is tethered to that of other people throughout the world, and moreover, to that of other species of life and the environment. What are the stories that we tell ourselves in dark times? How can we enable a place for the living and envision an alternative future? There are no easy answers to these questions, but sometimes when it's quiet, I sense Dr. Angelou and my grandmother Perline in the distance, gesturing me in the direction of discovery and reminding me that just as nothing in the garden can grow without nutrients, care, and otherworldly forces, there can be no march towards peace and better worlds without the imagining that such a world is possible and the effort to experiment with this notion and habitually actualize it in our communal collective formations. Thank you so much.
It's my understanding that we have Dr. Adrienne Jones available to share some words about her dad, Professor Calvin Sharp.
Hi, can you hear me this time?
Oh, there you are. Hi, Dr. Jones.
Hi.
See you. Hello, hello.
Hardaway.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We'll have you share a couple words, and then after she does, Dr. Dean Adamson is going to join for his portion of the presentation.
Okay. I want to say good afternoon to everyone again. And I don't need to do any of the background on my dad. I thought Dr. Fraser did an excellent job. So I will just tell a story because I think it's timely and appropriate. So one of the reasons why I'm not there is because I just left Arizona trying to handle some business for my parents, including Calvin Sharp. And he, of course, he has a ALS and, is no longer sort of the same person that you might have known, ostensibly, because he doesn't move around and talk in the same way that he used to. However, for those of you who know Calvin or Professor Sharp, you know that his spirit is extremely lively, and he's lost none of that. So over the weekend when I was visiting him, I said, hey, it's almost time for the Sharp Angelou lecture. And they wrote to me and told me that it's going to be next week. And they have a speaker that they said, they were really interested in getting. Let me try to pull up the information so I can tell you exactly who it is. Lo and behold, it's Tash Frazier. This is one of my father's absolutely favorite people. He and his father, Larry, and my father are best of friends. And I have watched over the years as my father, Calvin, has fallen in love with Tash. And so when I said who the speaker was, he almost levitated off of the lounger that he sits in. He smiled, like everything just came to the fore. And I said, oh, okay, this is so fantastic. And I'm so glad that I didn't miss this moment. I mean, I'm actually happier that I was able to go and tell him about it and see his response than if I had had the opportunity to fly out, because then I wouldn't be able to tell you how appreciative and happy that I would say he considers Tash to be his nephew, second son. And so for that to come full circle this year, I think is very important. And two, I'm so sorry, Dr. Frazier's point, I think of my dad as an arc, right? He's someone who has sparked many of us because he does think that peace, reconciliation, standard conciliation, sort of daily conciliation can exist. And I think that he has supported us and encouraged us so that we will go out into the world and do the kinds of different work that we are doing. And so despite his health challenges, I am pleased that he is still doing this work. So thank you for inviting me to say a couple of words. Thank you for the lecture. That I will do a bang up job of providing a blow-by-blow report, and hope that I can get a copy of this event, including Dean Adamson, who is now my colleague also, who I've done some work with recently, because I'm sure that my dad will be thrilled to have the opportunity to see the lecture this year. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Dean Brian Adamson.
Oh, this is not connected? Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
All right, cool. Okay, great.
Okay, good afternoon. First and foremost, I want to thank Professor Hardaway for inviting me to be a part of this. It is more than I could have hoped for, or bargained for, because seeing the richness of the connections between Taj and Dr. Jones and Calvin and Professor Sharp. I knew him as Professor Sharp, then I knew him as Calvin. and the history that we share in this space is pretty remarkable and moving, and especially to hear Dr. Jones's words about her father. Thank you for those, and to especially be part of this lecture, this education that you gave, Tosh. Thank you very much. Thank Eric and for organizing and putting all of this together, as well as as Professor Hardaway as well. And what I wanted to do is sort of pull in exploration of some of the things that Taj raises in attempting to make a connection between some of my work and research and three themes that undergird his talk here. The idea of peace and reconciliation and the fight for freedom, particularly as regards marginalized groups and individuals within those groups. And one of the issues that I've continued to work on in part of my media law work is the way in which the media behaves and enacts the construction of people's images in the way in which it reframes even movements by Blacks and other claimsmakers as regards their attempts to achieve peace, reconciliation, not only with their presence, but also with their past, and most importantly, their fight from freedom from oppressive institutions. And so I just want to share the sort of an overview of some of the work that I've done in this space, and hopefully it's something that you might find of value and useful and interesting. And this is my thesis, this idea that through basic and almost unconscious practices by the media, through their news gathering routines that they engage in every day, and their reporting processes, they recreate and reinforce adverse stereotypes, and so reinforcing structural racism in our institutions, and in also doing so, particularly as it regards social movements, reinforce and reaffirm majoritarian, that is white supremacy over Blacks and other politically marginalized groups. And I take two approaches in trying to unpack this thing. Particularly, I look at the construction and the reconstruction of Black deviance, present and past, as well as how the media treats claims of oppression, claims of rights and civil rights by Blacks through protests. So before I continue, something occurred just yesterday that brought this into relief again. I opened up Cleveland.com newspaper to see a story that was headlined as such. But accompanying that story was this image. And it perfectly encapsulates the point, right? The way in which media articulates and frames and what it elects and selects to choose as its subject, as its topic, and by extension, how that impacts the way we view individuals as well as ideas and institutions and peoples. And so that just pretty much said it all. Where I begin my research is looking at some of the documents from slavery and looking at news stories, particularly with regards to news stories and crime, and a newspaper called The Proceedings of the Rebellious Negroes. That was a newspaper that existed between 1690 and 1775. And it basically accounted or chronicled issues regarding Blacks in America, particularly with regards to crimes and the commissions of crime. But I also look at how contemporary examples, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, George Floyd, and others, how the media constructs and talks about those individuals and how they present those individuals, and looking at the way in which they perpetuate these ideas of Black male fear and Black male deviance. And then finally, what I also look at is this idea of adultification. Social studies and extensive studies have demonstrated that Black boys are perceived as older than white boys or other groups of individuals. And by extension, through that perception, are made to seem more fearsome and are constructed as more fearsome and are described as men as opposed to boys or even teenagers. We see some vivid examples of the construction of, how did that happen? There we go. We see some vivid examples of the construction of Black men and Black deviants in some of the more recent examples, particularly by individuals who were core agents in the killings and deaths and the prosecutions or the absence of prosecutions of the police perpetrators. So we saw police officer Darren Wilson describe Michael Brown as this in his testimony before the grand jury. It looked like a demon, describing Michael Brown. Our own prosecutor McCullough, in his press conference where he announced the no bill against the police officers in Tim Rice's death, said this: "He looked bigger than his age would suggest." And finally, police officer Jason Van Dyke about Laquan McDonald. This dehumanization of Black men and this construction of them as something feared or otherworldly or other or even demons are born out of the imagination of the people who are responsible for killing those very individuals. And these descriptions are then perpetuated and animated and advanced into the media without criticism and without proper context or without proper pushback. And so those are some of the examples, and then we can go on and on of them. That well, those are just a few. But I also talk about media as, and I wanted to give you this quote here. James Baldwin said it better than anyone, right? That this construction of the Negro in the popular imagination is totally unrelated from reality, but has its purpose, it has its role, and has consequences, deadly consequences in many cases, unfortunately. My conclusion is basically that the media relies heavily, because it relies heavily on criminal law institutions, like police departments and the court systems for its news content. There is this interdependence that occurs between newspapers and criminal justice systems, where the media is then constructing narratives about crime and about the behavior of those actors who are involved in the criminal justice system. And that becomes the predominant or the prominent narrative that occurs in what we read, in the newspapers that we read, and in the news that we ingest, what we see and what we hear. That becomes the dominant narrative. The story as told from the institutional agents, the police officers, the court systems, right? Just because as a routine in news gathering, newspapers appoint their journalists, their writers to courthouses, to the police stations, to daily scan and look at the police blotter. Okay, who's gotten arrested, who's been arrested, who is in court, convicted of or being charged with a crime, right? And so it does these things, and doing these things, it creates the narrative against which not only individuals but groups have to work against, particularly when it comes to claims making and when it comes to protests and arguing for the rights of our people and our individuals. and also through the routines of storytelling and the routines of narratives, we find that newspapers reinforce this sort of majoritarian ethos of seeking to advance and promote order over chaos, trying to insist when and where order will come when there are uprisings, yet at the same time reveling and marketing and exploiting the violence that might take place in some protests and some as a part of as an offshoot of some legitimate protests, right? We also found with regards to protests that are looking at newspapers reports over the score of about 40 years between 1960 and roughly 1996. Researchers studied approximately 24,000 stories about protests. And based on those news stories, two conclusions became abundantly clear. One, when the protesters were Black, the police were more often to be there, to be a central presence in those protests. And then two, at those protests, more often than not, there was violence and there was arrest associated by the police presence. Right? And we see this as a recurring theme in terms of the way in which marginalized groups express their objections to injustice, to police brutality, and etc. It's met with violence, and then that violence then creates a new narrative around which opinion can be had around observations. And the idea of opinion is important because the media has this really outside ability to influence the way in which we, not only what we see, but how we think about what we see. And I advance in my work two media theories on this particular issue. The theory of cultivation and the theory of priming. Now, cultivation theory posits that first order effects, they talk about first order effects, that frequent television viewers compared to less frequent television viewers have very different opinions about reality and even skewed visions of reality. So for example, studies have shown soap opera viewers. Do they still have soap operas?
Yes.
Yes, they still have soap operas. So soap opera viewers, heavy soap opera viewers tend to overestimate the rate of divorce in the United States versus people who don't view soap operas that much, right? There are also heavy news viewers tend to overestimate the dangers from floods, from being struck by lightning, or even terror attacks, more so than less frequent viewers. And that's the idea behind cultivation theory, that frequent television viewing causes audience to skew their understandings of reality. The second term effects of cultivation theory is what they call the mean world phenomenon. The idea that persistent exposure to television news, particularly about violent crime, increases the salience of violent crime to that individual, and also increases their fear or concern that violence could happen to them. That's even in cases where those individuals being studied are in crime-free zones, where the crime rate in their particular neighborhood is low. They still nonetheless adopt these mean world theories based on the news that they view. So that's cultivation theory. Priming theory, that refers to the short-term impact of exposure to a mass-mediated stimulus on subsequent judgments or behavior. It's rooted in cognitive science and psychology, and priming is basically a heuristic, right? And so it is the way in which we see something and it activates a mental schema and a pattern in our mind where we associate what we see now with a past experience or with a past schema, and we map it onto what we've seen before. The way that comes into play is that when we see over time what is in fact where on television news, Blacks outnumber others in criminal roles than others, and as opposed to being in socially positive roles on daily newspapers and in newscasts. And when actually compared to the demographic and crime statistics, these portrayals overrepresent the role of Blacks as crime perpetrators. But what priming does, it instills in the minds of the viewers that they will associate Blackness with the crime. And so what happens with regards to media is where you see Blacks in positions where they are on perp walks in orange suits, are handcuffed, are somehow in carceral, bound by incarceration. Those tend to prime people's association with Blackness and crime. Another unique way in which the association is made is that when newscasts do not name the individual, a Black individual, where you have an undifferentiated person on the screen or in a text, it tends to allow someone's cognitive mapping to be applied to any general Black person. These have real world effects, not only with regards to the impact that it has on people's cognition, but impact on how we talk about crime, and how we talk about people, and people who we think are more prone than not to commit certain crimes. So I talked a little bit about that, and just to close out, maybe 2 more minutes to close on this, some other theories that inform the work here, and then those deal with symbolic interactionism. The idea that we think of and we think about and we behave based on symbols, based on signs and the way in which we communicate, and the idea that we have shared symbols of understanding people, things, events, etc. And symbolic interactionism is a window into which we can look at media and media texts. The idea of rumor theory propagation and dialogue is how people tend to work out uncertain information, how people tend to share information about news stories, about ambiguous information, and how we take roles in rumor and in terms of advancing rumors, advancing ideas within our social circles. Rumor theory sort of basically posits that if, as we engage on everyday conversations, did you hear the news yesterday? Did you read about this? Did you read about that? We are not only sharing information, we're working out our own understandings between members of our social circle. And in doing so, that has a reinforcing effect upon our beliefs, our attitudes, our values about a thing we saw, or that shared thing we saw, and that shared thing we read, right? And as a result, it may lead to influencing not only how we process news, but how we think about news information, how we act on news or information, right? It impacts how we talk about, how we think about public opinion polls, how we take public opinion polls, right? And we just saw this a couple of weeks ago when Professor Atiba was here giving a lecture, talking about how rumors around voter fraud influences policy, influences rules and laws that are changed, but because of all of the ways in which rumors and misinformation and conspiracy theories become very sticky, right? And so we see these extensions that I try to talk about here. Based on our discourse, it influences our policy choices, influences even jury deliberations, and influences opportunities for meaningful conversations to reconcile issues of oppression and injustice. And finally, I offer prescriptions with regards to what, if any, laws respond to these adverse stereotypes that are advanced or that are talked about in the media, and how we deal with these, and whether or not the First Amendment, where we have these rules around freedom of speech and assembly and association, whether the First Amendment responds or addresses or redresses some of the issues that we see. Does hate speech, is someone calling a person a thug or a group a thug, for example, is that hate speech? Is it defamation? Are they true threats? And who is culpable for propagating or uttering those true threats or that defamation or that hate speech? Should we be exploring regulation of broadcasts? Should we be exploring or revisiting the FCC's rules regarding licensing of broadcast stations or cable television news networks, which are not similarly licensed as broadcast news networks, have, generally speaking, a freer hand at what they talk about and how they talk about things. And we know now most people get their news from non-broadcast networks. We talk about whether minority ownership is an answer, as in with regards to not just affirmative action, but increasing minority ownership of news stations, of media outlets, and whether or not, in fact, that changes anything in terms of removing or mitigating the adverse stereotypes we see around Blacks and Black claim making. Is Black Twitter the answer with regards to extra-institutional activism? And then finally, journalistic practices. What should journalists be doing? What should the policies be around how they gather news? Should newspapers continue to print and publish mugshots of people who were arrested merely, right? San Francisco was one, San Francisco's police department, for example, was one police department that decided that once and for all, they would not tender over mugshots of people they arrested because of this very issue. Should more jurisdictions be considering that? I would certainly say yes, but that is an overview of some of the work that I've been doing and work I've been engaged in. So thank you.
I know that folks online, we're going to wrap up and do Q&A, but I know folks online want the CLE code. And so Mr. Seiler is going to share that on the screen now. I don't know do we have a mic? Oh, we do. I'm sorry, I'm looking right at you. Question and answer. Do we have questions in the chat online? Okay, no questions there. Do we have any questions in the room? I know we went a little bit, oh yes, please, Ali. I'm gonna ask you guys to answer.
Hello, good. Hello. Well, my name's Ollie. By the way, I'm a third-year law student at Case. Dr. Frazier, I got a message underlying throughout your lecture about like a sense of community. From my experience in law school, I think it's been easy to get siloed into various groups. Like we would take a class that is about a certain topic and then all of us would just agree and be like, yep, that's messed up. And then there's not a lot of engagement with differing voices that we could convince otherwise. How would you say that we can bring in all voices instead of just instead of lawyers who are like-minded, just being alone and just talking about the options that they think are good? How do we bring in other groups like social scientists, engineers? Like my dad's an engineer, if I go talk to him, he doesn't know what bail reform is. Even though I sent him my article that he won't read. But yeah, I guess that's my question.
I can relate. I know what it is to write an article and send it to family and they say, oh, that's great. And then and then pile, So I think, sure. So I think
unfortunately, sometimes the message, the people who we might want to receive a certain message, that might not be their time to receive it. And so I think, the challenge is trying to find different people, groups who, let's not even say are open to your message, but are open, number one, to being in a space of the sharing of different ideas, different perspectives. And I would say too, the kind of healthy debate. I think one of the challenges in terms of the times in which we're living is that in many ways there aren't enough public venues, public forums for differing opinions in a kind of healthy manner. And I think it's, especially in spaces like this, it's, you know, what graduate school, undergrad, you know, studying for your JD allows for us, first off, physical space, physical environments, as well as to some degree resources where people can kind of come together and use a legal brief as a space to have contending kind of viewpoints and perspectives about bail reform, about restorative justice, or even just about unpacking, you know, do we think, what is the purpose, like, why is bail a means to determine who, you know, gets to either be within the kind of carceral state or who gets to be without it and then have their moment in front of a court of law, like having those kind of difficult, challenging conversations, but as well, I'd say too, like incorporating the perspectives of people who are actually impacted by bail, right? So having people who've actually been incarcerated as a result of not having $2,000 or, you know, some amount that some of us might say, oh, that could lean on the family members, and people who say, look, I don't have that kind of infrastructure, that kind of community network of people to rely upon to cover that. So actually having conversations that shift away from even the abstract and having, you know, exchanges with people who can tell us about the kind of lived conditions of it. Because I think that too, over time, might impact people's perspectives where they at least they can't say that they have not heard those perspectives and they have not looked in the eyes of someone who is directly impacted by that. So I do think more environments that facilitate that, and less sometimes of us just looking at screens and hearing those kind of conversations, but actually being in a space with someone, laughing with them, you know, hearing about their pain, hearing from their family members. One thing I'll just reference too is I was talking about that organization Chaos Network, and one of the things they've done, so they partnered with colleagues of mine where they basically hacked payphones. They basically, the payphone, I don't know if you guys remember payphones, right? Your payphones are ubiquitous, you know, that's when you payphone to call your parents up to pick you up from somewhere. Anyway, you know, there are a bunch of payphones in Los Angeles that like just don't work. They just sit there. The city hasn't even removed them. And so they bought a whole bunch of payphones and they brought together community members from different parts of primarily South Central Los Angeles and technologists and academics kind of come together. And the idea was like, if we could hack this and turn it into kind of like a public artwork, a public mode of communication between different communities, like what would we want the payphone to say? And so what that led to was people actually having real conversations about the inequities in the city. It led to them having real conversations about like urban blight, about gentrification, about connection. And what happened was, I mean, the outcome was people turned these payphones into devices where you heard oral histories, where you heard young people's music, where you learned about businesses. But really, what mattered most wasn't really the outcome, but the process. Like, if anything, the outcome was great, but really the process was the outcome, bringing these people together who wouldn't conventionally be together to have these kinds of exchanges. In any case, they actually partnered 2 years ago with an organization that's committed to drawing more awareness around people on death row. And they created one of these kinds of installations with the payphones. And what happened was when you got to these payphones, you heard the stories of people who were actually on death row, but you also got to hear the stories from their family members, right? About the impact of losing a parent or a sibling or someone who's a central node in that kind of community network who's now gone, and the impact of that. And I think that's another piece of it too, that it's not simply just looking at the people who we think are directly impacted, but how that extends outward in the branches of all that. So anyway, I mean, that's not an easy answer to, but I think in terms of bringing those groups together, I mean, food is good. You know, and then trying to use, you know, both your identities and your positionalities as entry points to talking about these kinds of subjects.
And then I had another question for Dean Adamson. I don't know if I don't want to hog the questions either. You mentioned about cultivation theory and then priming. And you talked about people who go off and watch or consume a specific media outlet. What about people who indirectly consume? Like the thing that came to mind initially was, I don't know, you scroll on Twitter, you see someone's bad take about something, but you're still consuming it.
Yeah, right.
How does that impact everything?
Yeah, the cultivation theory, the early work in cultivation theory distinguished heavy look at television primarily, television viewers versus lighter television viewers and define heavy television viewers as those who spend, I believe it was more than 12 hours a week on news, maybe it was more than that. But in any event, with regards to how we see and view Twitter, or what say for example on Twitter feed, that goes to a couple of things on a few levels. One, the way in which we engage media alters our whole way of thinking about it. So the mental processes that I engage when I read a paper is very different than when I'm scrolling through my Twitter feed. And the way a story is told is very different, right? And so that impacts the way in which you might think, where you might be able to easily or readily dismiss something as clickbait, or this is crazy, I'm going to ignore this. But what comes important with regards to social media is are two things. One, how we curate our own social media. So the fact that we can be selective and self-selective about what we choose to bring into our space says a lot about how we think about media and what we want to think about. And then two, to the extent that we share what they call homophily, a shared belief that with my friends, people who think like me, I'm going to likely share or pass something on that I feel very strongly about, and that my friend also feels very strongly about. So there's going to be this reinforcing effect of sharing things on social media. There are three, get too far into it, I'll just say this. There are three things that happen when we share things in social media, we pass things on, even orally. There's a leveling, and there's a sharpening, and then there's, third word is even more, I'm trying to think of it right now. But when we level something, that is, say, we just give the high points. We might have a story that's 500 words and we level it. That way, so I'm only going to share with you 200 words. And then when I pass it on to Ms. Hayford, I'm going to give you just the high points. Oh, check out what they said about this. And then I'm going to pass the story on. She might pass it on to Nadia and just say, hey, check this out, right? So the way in which news stories get passed on amongst people also influences the way in which we view the thing. I've already primed her to think about the story in a different way, just by the way I set it up. And she in turn has primed Nadia in a way to think about the story. So that's how news between interpersonally and amongst social media enacts and behaves to influence the way in which we see things and see issues.
Well, that'll be our last question. Thank you all.